I think, we have this cult of the free market, this idea that supply and demand determines everything from the price of pizza to how much you're going to pay ChatGPT to use its technology. And in reality, what we see is that most major markets in the United States are, if not managed, at least structured by the state directly. So banking and finance is an obvious one that's close to my heart and my own academic interests. Healthcare, pharmaceuticals, airlines. We could keep going through the list of industry after industry. If you add them up, you're well over half of GDP. And so my point in writing Marketcrafters was not to say that structuring markets is always good. It's just, hey guys, we do this. These markets are not mythical and self-regulating. We got to learn how we succeed and how we fail so that we can do it better in the future.
So, in the conclusion of your book, you state that successful market craft requires a clear mission, a coordinating institution who can hold accountable, and the investment of power in that institution to accomplish its work. Can you elaborate on why we need those conditions?
When you see public policymakers managing and guiding markets towards a public goal, like making Americans richer, making their financial lives more stable, future-proofing against climate, that is market crafting. So I go through all kinds of successes and failures in the book. The upshot is that when we succeed, it tends to be because we invest in an institution, as you were saying, with a clear mission. So for instance, the Fed has a clear mission: price stability and full employment. We give them a lot of power to do it. And then we give them the discretion, the bit of insulation from the ups and downs of the political cycle to succeed. And so that story, listen, these institutions still fail. The Fed is clearly not perfect. But on balance, when we invest in institutions with that kind of model, they're able to deliver on things like price stability, financial stability, and other bigger picture goals. But the problem is we tend to avoid creating these institutions in the first place. This fear of centralized power, particularly in economic policymaking, means that the markets often don't work the way that we want them to, and there's no one to hold accountable because there's no institution responsible for delivering.
So where do you stop, and how do you prevent market crafting from becoming a victim of the political process? The Fed in recent years became controversial, perhaps for having too active a role in the U.S. economy, both through quantitative easing and through keeping short-term interest rates, very low. And then the Fed also came under fire for its policies for meddling, some would say, in climate change and in other areas that people saw as outside the Fed's mandate. So whose market, who gets to define the market, and how do you prevent that from becoming a victim of the political process that is then whipsawed back and forth through different administrations?
Well, the Fed has a boss. It's Congress. Congress decides what the mandate of the Fed is and what its tools are to get that done. And that's a work in progress. Like, the Fed was founded in 1913. Completely reorganized in 1935. And in the late 70s, Congress set a clear mission for the Fed for price stability, full employment, and moderate long-term interest rates. And the Fed believes that financial stability is an additional goal that, while it's not in the legislation, is important to deliver on that mandate. And so you talk about something like climate change. Well, the Fed, actually, of all the global central banks, has been the least involved in thinking about the impacts of climate change. But it did make the decision in the late 2010s and in 2020 to start thinking seriously about how climate risk could change the nature of insurance markets, could change the nature of banking and finance, believing that was part of its mission. It set up internal kinds of stress testing exercises for large institutions to think about climate changes and catastrophes. It was not doing things like other central banks have done, like buying green bonds and this and that, because it didn't believe that it had the authority to do it. So what I'm trying to say is that you need these institutions that have the discretion to think about how to fulfill their missions. And when and if they overstep that is the role of Congress, is to redefine what those boundaries are. In other cases, it might be the courts. In some cases, it might be the media. There are these methods of accountability that are important to have.
I think as an example of clear mission and clear practice, I'm not so sure the Fed will fit. And it says, yes, it has a clear mission. But as you said, financial stability was something that the Fed introduced in it and interpreted in the way they wanted. As you say in the book, they could have saved Lehman. They had all the authority to do so. They chose not to. It's not clear that they had the authority of doing everything they did during the financial crisis. They did. And during COVID, it was even worse. They made up stuff. They were justified by the political moment with a lot of arbitrariness. And Congress was quite silent, exposed actually. Dodd-Frank, to some extent, was an attempt to limit the power of the Fed to intervene, but failed because then COVID came and the Fed did with gusto what had done during the financial crisis in spite of a legislation like Dodd-Frank to limit. So to some extent, the fear of this power is that these powers are used in a way that is not necessarily in aligned with Congress. And sometimes might be good, sometimes might be bad, but it's a little bit scary.
Well, there's a lot there. So just to start with the great financial crisis, I think you're right to say that the Fed improvised, and they made a huge mistake in the Lehman decision. As I go into detail in the book, we have this false dichotomy of institutions have to fail or they have to be bailed out, when there are all kinds of examples of structured bankruptcies that prevent the kind of market chaos that Lehman provided. I mean, Alan Greenspan's own Fed a decade earlier had done that with the largest hedge fund in the world, long-term capital management. So that was a meaningful failure. And at the same time, the Fed as an institution that fall and over the coming months, working with Treasury and the Congress on the TARP bill, created a suite of programs that prevented even further financial meltdowns. Now, Dodd-Frank, you're right, was a very illustrative moment of what I was talking about earlier, where Congress says, wait a second, we don't want you to have the power to bail out any single one institution. If there's a problem, you have to create a facility that a lot of different institutions have access to. And even then, it is an emergency power that you had. And so later on, you saw, further on in the SVB crisis, it was working within the constraints of Dodd-Frank that the Fed and the FDIC and others responded to that moment. And in the COVID crisis, I think you're not exactly right. I mean, the COVID set of interventions and programs were audacious and big, but they were well within the law. And Congress even said, we think that we want the Fed to have this power, and we want it to go further and be the custodian for the medium-sized lending program that it created. The point I'm trying to make, though, is that these financial markets are not free. They're not working on their own. The institutions of government are structuring them, not just in the bailout moments, in the moments of crisis, but in the moments that come after, the quantitative easing that the Fed pursued for years after the COVID crisis, all of the lending programs that existed. We have this vision of financial markets that are more stable, and we create a whole host of institutions to deliver on that. And that's a normative political decision, which has ups and downs. It's not good in and of itself, but it is a market that's well crafted, that's crafted.
But maybe I'm a little bit misled by the term market crafting, because it seems to me that you're talking about market entrepreneurs that shape markets. The term market craft, if I'm not mistaken, was introduced by a political scientist, Vogel, who meant that politicians make the market work for everyone. I don't see Greenspan making the market for everyone. I don't think the Fed in general making the market work for everyone. In fact, I think the Fed by and large, makes the market work for millionaires, not for everyone. So, in what extent is the Fed a market crafter in the Vogel sense?
I don't think Vogel would say that the only way that market craft can apply is if markets work for everyone. I'm not even sure what markets, if any markets, work for everyone. I think that the point is that you can use public policy to shape markets in a particular direction. So we've been talking a lot about finance, but we could, I have several chapters in the book on semiconductors. There's a political goal. We need to make semiconductors here in the United States for national security reasons. And then you use public investment, to some extent, trade policy. You could use procurement. You could use stockpiling in order to support that industry, because you believe that market needs to be crafted, and in this case supported, to meet your political goals. And so, this is obviously a recent story in the Chips and Science Act that began in the first Trump administration and then was passed in the Biden administration, but it goes back way further. I spend a lot of time on the book looking at Reagan era industrial policy, Reagan era market craft, where the semiconductor industry in the United States was under significant threat from Japanese competition at the time. And there you saw the creation of a new institution, this one called Semitech, that not only had Marshall resources, but more importantly, brought all the major American manufacturers, not just of the semiconductors themselves, but of the components that went into them, to Austin, Texas, to coordinate, suspending the antitrust rules, to say that we want this kind of collaboration. And you got a breakthrough. American chip production was going down for years, and then by the time of the early 90s, we're back over 50%, and the Japanese were suffering. So, market craft is not just markets for everyone. In fact, when I see it working, it tends to be for a more concrete, specific political goal, which could be national security, financial stability, energy security, a lot of the different things that we can talk about.